Greetings. Welcome to my hologram universe. My name is Jordie Gagnon. I am Métis and originally from Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. My Red Talk today will center around Indigenous agriculture and the effects of colonization and its impact on perceived successes and failures of Indigenous agriculture. My educational experience has been an interesting one, to say the least. As the son of a Métis bricklayer, laborer, cowboy, and eventual farmer and rancher, I grew up on the land. I learned through doing hands-on work and from watching and listening. My dad has always struggled. He has very little education, and this is, in my opinion, a result of the colonization and the conquering of the West. I will be discussing my family's history and background in farming and how the successes and failures of my family's history have been impacted over the last 150 years. My great-great-great-grandfather was Michel Dumas, born in 1849 to the parents of Michel Dumas Jr. and Adelaide L'Esperance. Michel was educated at a mission school, and upon completion, he was destined to attend further education to become a priest. He decided to take up farming as a family occupied a river lot in the Red River area that is now known as Winnipeg. As the numbered treaties were in the process of being signed, this meant a shift towards an agrarian lifestyle for Indigenous people moving forward. It is noted that Michel had a parcel of land, 2 horses, 8 cows, 1 bull, and several farming implements. However, Michel's family was unfairly dispossessed of their family's land by Indian agents who were offering scrip in exchange for land to build the CWP Railroad. A simple X signed over a river lot that was meant to provide my ancestors a way of life as a farming family. I have questioned how an educated man of the time could have only signed his family's land away using an X rather than signing his name. How could an educated man have done such a thing? The effects of colonialism resonate as settlers and government came and took with whatever means necessary. I feel as though Michel was a victim of a great wrong, one that has never been corrected. Michel was one of Riel's captains during the 1869-70 resistance at Red River. 10 years after, his family moved to what is now St. Louis, Saskatchewan in 1880. He was one of the men who traveled to Montana with Gabriel Dumont to get Louis Riel prior to the resistance in Batoche in 1885. Dumas was the One Arrow Reserve farming instructor and served for a time as secretary of Louis Riel's governing council. While he did end up taking up arms against the government of Canada in the resistance of 1885 in the Battle of Batoche, his employment as a farming instructor for the First Nation community of One Arrow demonstrated his ability, skill set, and knowledge of farming shows just how apt Indigenous farmers could be. They had the knowledge of the land and its growing seasons. They were able to manage and work with animals with confidence. Then, if this was the case, how could they not be successful with agriculture, farming, and ranching when they had demonstrated that they could be? The challenge was that the government, although signing treaties to promote an agrarian lifestyle, did not want Indigenous farmers to be successful. Agriculture was a chosen path for First Nations to follow towards civilization. Hayter Reed, who was the Deputy Superintendent of General Indian Affairs from 1893 to 1897, stated, "Agriculture was the great panacea of what was perceived to be the ills of Canada's Indians. This is despite the fact that many reserves were located in areas that were unsuitable for agriculture. Government agencies later used the low success rate of First Nations farmers as a reason to reduce the size of reserves. This is an impact that caused First Nation and Métis farmers to lose even more land because they were set up to fail on land that couldn't be used for productive agriculture. As Jennifer Petit states in her article From Agriculture Training to Residential Schools, by the time the numbered treaties and the reserve system were created, Indigenous people in what is now Western Canada faced dire conditions. Many communities were ravaged by diseases such as smallpox and devastated by the whiskey trade. The bison, on which they relied, was almost extinct. The Canadian government once again decided that the solution was model farms to accompany a policy of peasant farming through which Indigenous families were to receive 2 acres and a cow, and through which they were not encouraged to utilize any labor-saving machinery. Non-Indigenous farmers were using labor-saving machinery. So why was one group and not the other using such machinery to produce successful results? The government felt that this would ensure Indigenous peoples would be converted to a sedentary farmers, but would not be so successful that they would compete with the new settlers who were moving west. Not surprisingly, the plan failed. Non-Indigenous farmers were given an allocation of land to start their farming operations at a cost of zero to little to no money. Government bureaucrats at the time blamed the supposed lazy Indians, and as historian Sarah Carter has since proven, Indigenous peoples were interested in farming, but that the government's policies and practices undermined reserve agriculture. More important to the government was a new system of schools for Indigenous children. As Petit continues, she notes, originally thought to be a quick and relatively inexpensive way to deal with what administrators deemed the Indian problem, the schools had evolved into a costly and complicated system that was not producing significant results. As a consequence, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was appointed the position of Superintendent of Indian Education in 1909, changed the professed goals of schools for Indigenous peoples from integration to segregation. In 1923, officials merged the industrial boarding schools and the residential schools took life. Scott believed that Indian people should be removed from their environment and be obliterated. In 1920, he made the statement, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic and there is no Indian question." On one hand, they're trying to create, on paper, resources and a plan to assimilate Indigenous people into white society. But on the surface, that seemed fine. When in reality, they were just trying to prove that a way of life in agriculture was going to be a result of Indigenous people not being able to or being too lazy to be productive farmers. However, Indigenous agriculture was not a new concept in and around that time. They had for a long time grown their own vegetables and were harvesting their own crops in the mid to late 1800s. This made it difficult for settlers because now they had competition for their product in market. A permit and pass system was created to determine what could and couldn't be and when things could be sold at market. If a First Nations person wanted to harvest and sell their crops in market, they needed the approval of Indian agents on reserve to allow them off reserve to sell this. I've been told stories as to Indigenous farmers and ranchers who couldn't even butcher their own animals to provide food for their family. And that just shows you the great control that Indian agents had and the Canadian government had over Indigenous people on reserve. They had proved to be very effective, even though a peasant farming policy put in place created a system that was destined to fail, and for obvious reason. I chose to speak on this topic for a few reasons. First, I identify as Métis and Indigenous. I come from a farming background. I'm a grad student who works now at the University of Saskatchewan for the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. What I can tell you from my 39 years on this earth is that there's always more to the story than what we know on the surface and what we continue to learn every day. In my opinion, we all grew up not knowing any better. Chances are, if you are an Indigenous person, your parents probably didn't tell you about the trials and tribulations. I know my parents sure didn't. I know that my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father all tried their hands at farming and ranching. I watched as my dad battled addiction through trauma that to this day I still don't know completely. He had lack of education, but with that being said, he was very intelligent. I knew my dad as somebody who worked his ass off to seemingly never get ahead. I viewed this as wasted time, and maybe I'm wrong in viewing it that way, but growing up, that's how I viewed it. I saw both my parents work tirelessly to seemingly, like I said, never get ahead. I didn't have the luxury of meeting my great-grandfather or grandfather, but by oral accounts of who they were the lunch pail guys, the guys who would outwork anyone, who wore their hearts on their sleeves, who would give the shirt off their back if you needed. I assume this is true because that's how my dad is and that's how he raised me. I'm actually quite fond of the farming lifestyle and the lifestyle that I grew up in. If I grew up with a better model of success, and that's not to fault my parents, but more so to fault a system that didn't always allow for my parents to be successful in agriculture. I could have taken over our family farm and continued on. But I didn't realize, I guess, until my late 20s, there was a system in place that, underlies success in who's successful and who isn't. It's not that my dad didn't work hard. He works harder, as hard or harder than any of the neighboring farms, hands down, without a doubt. He was never expected to succeed because of this silent system of colonization that still exists to this day. And now, with the expense to get into farming, is virtually impossible for anyone to make that their only job. I watched growing up other families with growing farms. They were able to secure farming loans. They were able to use equity to increase land capacity, number of their animals, and a better productive machinery. My dad could never secure those types of cash advances. I don't know if that was from the color of his skin or outlying factors that maybe I'll never understand. I don't know. But it did prevent him from being a successful farmer. It was always low to mid-level production for us for varying reasons. Because we lived in a time where small farms were growing into medium to big type farms in order to be successful, and a mechanism to prevent anyone from getting to that mid-level to high level area of farming is something that's a challenge for Indigenous agriculture and Indigenous farmers. Um, I've mentioned that my dad doesn't have much education, but I can tell you that he is a very intelligent man. He knows his land and the land around our farm better than anyone. Um, he's incredible with animals. He's got a way that he understands the holistic value of them and respects them in a way um, that they should be. We always joked around that my dad, as a horseman, treated his horses better than he treated us as a family. Which, not to knock how he treated us, but he treated his animals very well. Um, I think that my dad relied on me to take our farm to the next level. But growing up, seeing a system that did not foster the type of success to make a livable wage for myself or my family, I chose a different path. Well, I think it's interesting. I ended up where I did. My current role within the College of Agriculture and Bioresources is to work with land and resource management in the programs that I work with. These programs were designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, and it's a program that allows Indigenous students an entry point into post-secondary education for our college. Other colleges have similar programs that are specifically designed for Indigenous students. Ours is just that entry point program that is relevant to communities. My role is so much more than that, however. My role also includes working with faculty and staff on the history of Indigenous peoples. And my goal in taking this EdMin class was to study the effects of colonization on the Maori people of New Zealand from the previous education, when the Maori suffered much through the same things that Indigenous cultures in Canada did. Back in 2005, I actually worked in New Zealand on a dairy farm, and I got to know the farmer there very well. He was a non-Indigenous farmer, and I told him about my background, and it all just adds to the story. Even 15 years ago, they were starting to create programs for Maori agriculture focused, and it's always kind of been a point of education for me myself. So I found it interesting, and this course really aligned with my background, with my current work, different things like that. So one of the biggest things that I find with the effects of colonizations is the results of colonization. Even though those effects still linger today, there's the positives that are coming from it. As Indigenous people, we're being more resilient. We're paving a path for future resilience through challenges and through efforts and things like that. I mentioned that the levels of abuse that were suffered. I know Dr. King mentioned in his videos that his father was beaten at school for taking responsibility for something that he didn't do. Those types of things have a lasting impact on how our future children and their children and their children's children will have an effect on perception of those bodies. But somebody like Dr. King is an example of somebody who had something traumatic happen to him and worked that much harder to make something of himself to ensure that that didn't happen to his family and his family's family moving forward. I see a lot of positivity in how things are being done, whether at our campus or at the University of Auckland. I mentioned that a continued resilience is or has been established. The biggest thing I noticed that's a positive is continuing to educate ourselves and grow in a society so that we can become role models for the next generation and the generation after that. In Indigenous culture, we talk about the 7 generations a lot. we're planning and doing now for 7 generations from now. I enjoyed the readings from this course very much, and I could have spent all day talking about them. And I think that the biggest thing that I take from those readings is the resilience piece and the action piece that has accompanied the resilience to ensure that the treaty signing of Waitangi isn't gone to waste, that culture and language are embedded in all forms of education from childhood to adulthood. And I think that the biggest thing is that we all have our story, and that's what this class has taught me the most, is about positivity, being a role model, and about how we can strive to do better together. I thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed the hologram feature.